Well, we've been working our way through the book of Daniel. We've also noted now on several occasions that Daniel was raised up by God to prophetically explain the time period called the times of the Gentiles. And this times of the Gentiles is the period when the nation of Israel is outside their land and being trampled down by various Gentile powers. And what's going to happen during this time period, we wouldn't know if God had not raised up Daniel. For example, how are the Hebrews to live on pagan soil? Well, we wouldn't know if God had not raised up Daniel and his three friends as role models. The book of Daniel has two parts to it. The historical section, chapters 1 through 7, and we've covered them now. And then the second section is the prophetic section of chapters 8 through 12. So we now have completed the historical section, which we saw in chapter 1, the introductory chapter. It was written in Hebrew. And I've spent now several weeks, if not months, working our way through chapters 2 to 7, which are, as we have said, chiastically structured. And so now we're into chapter 8, and the language is now changed back to Hebrew. While it was in Aramaic, it was dealing with Gentile nations, as it were, but now it's back into Hebrew, and it'll be primarily dealing with the nation of Israel in particular, and it's important to keep that in mind. So just to go through this chiastic structure, then again, the information and the theme in chapter 2 is repeated in chapter 7. The same theme and information in chapter 3 is repeated in chapter 6. And the information in chapter 4 is repeated in chapter 5. And so it's a literary pattern where Daniel is deliberately paralleling chapters that have a common theme. And so now in chapter 8 is the vision of the ram and the goat. So just looking forward a little to the next chapter, we will be in chapter 9, which is the vision of the 70 weeks of Daniel. And as I said on previous occasion, I'm hoping it won't take us 70 weeks to get through it. but who knows? And then chapters 10 to 12 is the final vision. And the whole thing really begins during the time of Daniel, meaning that starting in the days of Daniel, the prophecies throughout the book have a near and far fulfillment. In other words, some of the earlier prophecies in the book would have a literal fulfillment. That's a very important word, literal fulfillment, while Daniel is still alive. And then the later chapters, really beginning here in chapter 8, goes on into the intertestamental period and continues on into the future tribulation period and the millennial kingdom. And we see what God's final program is for the nation of Israel. So this evening then we begin to work our way through Daniel chapter 8. And one of my favourite Bible teachers called this chapter Israel's 4th of July. And if you're American or if you're in America on the 4th of July, you'll realise that that's Independence Day. And so I'd like to quote one of my favourite teachers, Andy Woods. And Andy Woods has this to say. He said, what is Daniel 8 about? Well, it's a story of independence. It's a story about how a nation fought against all odds, against overwhelming odds, with God on their side. And guess what? They achieved victory. They achieved victory and they achieved a window of independence during the intertestamental period, which lasted probably about 100 years. And so we come now to Daniel chapter 8, beginning at verse 1. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. Now, it's easy just to gloss over that information, and yet this information is very important because it tells us that this vision was given in about 1551 BC. And that's a date that you may probably want to write down because I'll be giving you a number of dates throughout this study, mentioned throughout this chapter. There'll be different dates come up. But Daniel saw these things before they happened. Daniel is probably a couple of years older than he was in chapter 7. He's probably now in his mid-60s. And I hope you understand this, that when you're reading the Bible, you're reading real history. This is not VeggieTales. This is not Jack and the Beanstalk. This is not the Tooth Fairy. This is not Santa Claus. This is real history. And these little pieces of historical pieces of information are given as a reminder that these things actually happened in the land of Israel. It's worth keeping in mind that Belshazzar, the last reigning king over the Neo-Babylonian Empire at the time, was in power as chapter 7 and 8 unfolded. Continuing on in the second part of verse 1 of chapter 8, it says, after the word Daniel, it says, after that which appeared unto me at the first. So this vision then takes place about 2 years after Daniel chapter 7. Now, one of the things that we have talked about is that chapter 7 and 8 are out of order. The book generally flows in chronological order, but chapters 7 and 8 are out of order. So here's the right order then. Chapters 1 to 4 take place chronologically, then chapters 7 and 8, then chapters 5 and 6, and then chapters 9 to 12. So 1 to 4, 7 to 8, 5 and 6, and 9 to 12. And why are 7 and 8 out of order? Because that section is not structured chronologically, but it is structured chiastically. And we've talked quite a bit about that, so there's no need to go on that over that again. Now, these events, or this vision, in terms of when he received the vision, takes place about 12 years before Daniel 5. You'll recall that Daniel 5, it's the handwriting on the wall chapter. It's the time period when the Babylonians will be overthrown by the Persians, without a battle, I might add. That historic political change hasn't transpired yet in chapter 5. It would be another 12 years before that happened. And notice very carefully in Daniel 8, verses 20 to 21, just jumping down for just a moment. This may be the key to properly interpreting everything in Daniel 8. It says, beginning at verse 20, the ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. That's the king of Greece. So who is this vision all about? Well, it's about 2 political powers. The one is Media Persia, the nation that was destined to overthrow Babylon, who Daniel was working for at the time. And then Daniel sees what would happen to Media Persia at the hands of the Greeks. You see, this chapter is very different than other things that we have studied thus far in Daniel. Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7 are the outer edges of the chiasm, and it gives us a panorama of world history. Both chapters described 4 Gentile empires that would exist on earth in the future, starting with Babylon, then moving on to Media Persia, then to Greece, and then to Rome. And there will be some sort of revived Rome of the Antichrist in the future, finally to be replaced by God's kingdom. So we have really essentially 6 kingdoms in total, according to my count. So you'll notice then that Daniel 8 and verses 20 and 21, what does it say? It says we're going to narrow the focus prophetically. We're focusing on Persia and then the empire which would follow Persia, which would be Greece. In Daniel 2, the statue represented 4 kingdoms. And what I have focused on here is the 2nd and 3rd kingdom, the chest and arms of silver and the belly and thighs of bronze. We're not focused on the legs, we're not focused on the head, and we're not focused on the toes. In Daniel 7, those various beasts that Daniel saw were the same kingdoms in a different form. They were beasts, and again they were focused on the bear and the leopard. And we're not focused at all on the lion, which would be Babylon, or the terrifying beast, which would be Rome, or the 10 horns, which would be the empire of Antichrist. We're focused specifically on the bear and the lion, Medo-Persia and Greece. We are focused on this bear, and that would be Persia. And Daniel 7 verse 5 says, and behold another beast, a second beast, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. And we're also focused on this leopard, which is Greece. And in Daniel chapter 7 verse 6 it says, after this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had on the back of it 4 wings of a fowl, and the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And when we were in chapter 7 last time, I gave a little bit of interpretation, if you like, on that. The only difference is Persia and Greece are represented by different animals in Daniel 8. The ram would represent Medo-Persia, the one-horned goat, and that would represent the empire of Greece. Why do I bring this to your attention? Well, I bring this to your attention not only so we can interpret this correctly, but to protect ourselves from all kinds of speculations about the Antichrist. The reality of the situation is these chapters are not about Antichrist. There are many other passages that we could go to in Scripture that you could go to get teaching about the Antichrist. But Daniel 8 is not directly about the Antichrist. But we may say that the Antichrist is alluded to. How so? Well, in type only, or in prefigurement only. Because once Greece deposes Persia, there's going to come someone from the empire of Greece who will be a Seleucid, who will launch such a horrific wave of persecution against the Jewish people that this Seleucid looks a lot like the Antichrist. We're not saying it is the Antichrist, we're saying it's like the Antichrist. In fact, he's so aggressive, he becomes a prefigurement, or a typology, if you will, of what the future Antichrist will do to the Jewish people. So this is why God had to intervene here, because the persecution was so severe. So the Antichrist here as a prefigurement through the final Seleucid ruler, a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. But the Antichrist, having said that, is not directly here, because this vision does not concern the empire of the Antichrist. It concerns Media, Persia, and Greece. So we need to be very careful about our theories of the Antichrist and from what scriptures we're developing those theories from. We have to grow to a point where we're using the word of God correctly. And just another interesting point, that in Daniel 8, there's not a lot of interpreting that we have to do with our divine imagination. Nearly everything in the chapter is interpreted for you. And so all I'll be doing this evening is bringing some little comments out along the way, because a lot of it is just self-evident, the interpretation. And so then we come to verses 2 to 14, which is the actual vision itself that Daniel saw in the year 551 BC. He saw, number one, a two-horned ram representing Medo-Persia, which is in verses 2 to 4. He saw, number two, he saw a one-horned goat representing Greece in verses 5 to 8. And finally, he saw this boastful little horn, this man, Antiochus Epiphanes, this Seleucid ruler who came from the empire of Greece, who is used in the book of Daniel as a type or prefigurement of the coming Antichrist. And we see that in verses 9 through to 14. So verse 2, and I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had two horns, and the two horns were higher, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Now the ram here was noted for its proportion in its horns. It says one was higher than the other. And this was an accurate prediction of the partnership between the Medes and the Persians, because the Persians were larger and stronger in the partnership, but they also emerged after the Medes, which is why it says the phrase, the higher came up last. And verse 4, it says, I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beasts might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. The Medo-Persian Empire exerted its power to the north, south, and west. It took territory, but made no major conquests towards the east. The principal theatre of their wars, says Calmet, was against the Scythians, which would be northward, against the Greeks, which would be westward, and against the Egyptians, which would be southward. And continuing in verse 5, it says, and as I was considering, behold, an eagle came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his two horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. So verse 5 says that while I was considering, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. So what does Daniel see? He sees the goat, and the goat represents Greece. He doesn't see 2 horns like with the ram. He sees 1 horn between the eyes of the goat. Well, who was that horn? It is the first leader of the Grecian Empire, a man named Alexander the Great. Notice the speed and velocity at which Alexander the Great conquered the known world. Daniel sees this centuries in advance as he sees this goat moving in every direction without even touching the ground, implying the speed of how he did it. That's a prophecy of what Alexander the Great did. It is a prophecy of such precision that only God could have and indeed did give to Daniel. Alexander the Great is a man who conquered the known world, probably about the age of 30, 32. And from what history we do have about him, reveals that he wept, for there was nothing else to conquer. That's how fast he did it. That's how fast he did away with the Persian Empire. And something that we should take note about here and recognise is the hand of God in this. Because Alexander the Great brought something to the known world which had not been known before, something called the Greek language. Alexander the Great's goal was Hellenization. He wanted a monolithic Greek culture. He brought in the Greek language, and that is what the hand of God allowed to happen. And so the right language was now in place, with its richness and fullness to record the revelation of Jesus Christ, called our New Testament. Written not in English but in Greek, God allowed Alexander the Great to come to power, and I believe partially it was for that reason. And in the book of Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, it says this: "But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law." So Jesus was not just dropped into history at any random time. He was dropped in history at a specific time. God even put the right language into place to record Jesus Christ and his great exploits and the church that was birthed as a result of his ministry. Verses 6 and 7, notice what it says. "And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand." I repeat that because what is Daniel seeing here? He's seeing Greece's conquest of Medo-Persia. Persia had conquered Babylon, and now Daniel sees Greece overthrowing Persia. And why did God allow it? Well, if you go back to the end of verse 4, describing Persia, it says he did as he pleased and magnified himself. So God does not allow people like that to go on forever in their state of pride, either individual or national. And so Persia's days were limited. Greece now comes to power. And again, think back to Daniel 8:1. These things were given to Daniel in the 3rd year of Belshazzar in 551 BC. What does that mean? Well, it means this, that Daniel is seeing these things 220 years in advance. Now, 220 years is a long time. Well, it certainly is on our clock and on our calendars, but maybe not on God's. But we continue into verse 8 with Greece, and it says, "The male goat magnified himself exceedingly. And as soon as he was mighty, the large horn," that would be Alexander the Great, "was broken off." So it's like a changing horn. It was great. Alexander the Great, although he conquered the world very rapidly, became as arrogant as his Medo-Persian and Babylonian predecessors. And thus he too was ripe for discipline and judgment of God. A man who conquered the world and yet wept because there was nothing left to conquer at the age of probably 30 to 32, died of debauchery. And the history books tell us, and some attribute it to alcoholism, others attribute it to a sexually transmitted disease or diseases. As I've been studying through this, apparently it's quite difficult to get some accurate information regarding Alexander. The commentators or the history buffs a little bit kind of overlap, but in other cases they kind of contradict, so it's a bit difficult to get the right information, but we do know the basics. But isn't it interesting that a man, he can conquer the world, but in many cases he cannot conquer the lusts of his flesh. And because the lusts of his flesh are in rebellion against God, and because man reaps what he sows, that a person that can't control the lusts of their flesh is putting into the ground seeds of their destruction. It doesn't matter how successful they are. It doesn't matter how gifted they are. It doesn't matter how intelligent they are. It doesn't matter how powerful they are. You look at Alexander the Great, you look at his life, and you look at his talent, you look at his success and his effectiveness, and yet he destroyed himself because as a man, he could not conquer the known world. Because as a man, although he conquered the known world, he couldn't rein in his simple appetites. What a lesson this is as we look at history lesson in advance and from the perspective of Daniel. How do we measure up? How is our commitment to God? How do we measure up with reining in our lusts? We all wrestle with the flesh. Look at Paul's letter to Romans chapter 6 and 7 about wrestling with the flesh. We have to mortify the flesh, crucify the flesh. Now back to verse 8. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great when he was strong. The great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones towards the 4 winds of heaven. The goat has a horn between its eyes, and it's broken off, and in its place grow 4 other horns. And may I just say to you, that's exactly what history records. Because you see, Alexander the Great, when he died at a very young age, about the age of 32, he had no hairs, no biological hairs. And so the historians again tell us that what became of Alexander the Great's empire, it was divided amongst his 4 generals. The top general was Cassander, and he took Macedonia. Lysimachus, he took Thrace and Asia Minor. And Ptolemy, he took Egypt, and then Seleucus took Syria, including the land of Israel. And here's what it looks like on the map. Oops. Most important one became Ptolemy and Seleucus. They're the 2 main dominant forces because of their location to the land of Israel. Because these 4 generals came 4 dynasties. The Seleucid dynasty, which is very important, and the Ptolemy dynasty, which is also very important. Cassandra and Lysimachus drop off the radar screen. Why? Well, that's because of their proximity away from the land of Israel. The focus of Bible prophecy is the nation of Israel. We need to always understand that, particularly when we come to Bible prophecy. And I'm sure you've come across the things that let people look for America in Bible prophecy. They look for Great Britain in Bible prophecy, and maybe it's the 5th digit on the left toe that's America, or some crazy idea. The Bible centers on Israel, and particularly in these prophecies of Daniel, it's all about the land of Israel. Now move down to verse 9, and it says, and out of them came forth a little horn which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. And an oath was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. And it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Now that describes exactly what Antiochus did. And so the little horn came up of the 4, and this man can be identified from history and from archaeology, and he is called Antiochus Epiphanes. He is described here in verse 9 as the boasted little horn. And he is someone who is coming to power in the Grecian Empire. And he is someone who is a foreshadowing or a type or a prefigurement of the coming Antichrist. Now, what is this little horn who prefigures the Antichrist going to do exactly? Well, notice, if you will, verse 10, as the prophecy continues, and it says, that's this little horn, i.e. Antiochus Epiphanes, waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. This is describing a wave of persecution that Daniel prophetically saw about 386 years in advance. Daniel saw these prophecies, as we said earlier, in 551 BC. He's now seeing something that the historians tell us happened around BC 170 to 164. Antiochus would begin to persecute Israel. And why is that? Well, it's because his goal was the same as Alexander the Great's goal, Hellenization. He wanted to make a monolithic singular Greek culture. Same Greek thought, same Greek language, same Greek religion, same Greek culture. And who stood right in the way? Well, wouldn't you know it, the tiny nation of Israel, with its own language, its own culture, and its own religion. And he began, this man Antiochus, according to Daniel's prophecies, to view the Jews as an obstacle to his goal. And is it interesting how things haven't changed much? This is exactly how the world community looks at the tiny state of Israel today. Israel is about the size of Wales in comparison. It's a little tiny nation, about 1% or less of all Middle Eastern territories, fighting for its very existence in the sea of Islamic theocracies, threatening to drive Israel into the sea. And yet the world community says, if Israel would just give up a little more land, we'd be happy. And this is exactly what was happening during the days of Antiochus, and it's happening today. Played out on our news media every night of the week. It's happening now in Israel. The bargaining chips, they're using their hostages as bargaining chips. And I don't want to go down that route too far, but they call this Trump's mega deal or peace deal. Let me tell you, folks, that is going to end in failure. True peace will not come to Israel until the Prince of Peace, Yeshua, Shalom, comes in peace to rule and to reign. There will be a time of false peace, but it won't last. That will, as I say, that will not come until Jesus Christ comes. And in Zechariah chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, God made a prediction through Zechariah concerning Israel in the last days. He said, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all people round about, when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all people of the earth be gathered against it. The last time I checked, all means all. All will be gathered against it. That includes the United Kingdom. That includes us here in Great Britain. It includes America. All means all. And all people will be gathered against it. So what did this man Antiochus do then? Well, he outlawed the Hebrew scriptures. He executed Jewish families who observed the Sabbath. He executed Jewish families who were involved in Jewish circumcision. Why? Because of Hellenization. They were in his way of progress. And so this is why this man, Antiochus, is almost like a prefigurement or a type, if you will, of the coming Antichrist. And verse 10, I want to just go over verse 10 again, because it says, and it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Now, what in the world does this mean? Well, one of the things that's interesting is stars in the Bible are used as metaphors for angels. For example, in Job chapter 38 and verse 7, it talks about the angels of God. While God was bringing forth creation on the days of creation, Job 38 verse 7 says, when the morning stars sang together. Well, who are the morning stars? Well, it goes on to say, it's and all the sons of God. In other words, angels, in other words, shouted for joy. And Daniel chapter 12:1 says this, now at that time Michael, an angel, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. God loves Israel so much that a person's position on the nation of Israel, whether it be pro or con, good or bad, causes a human being, whether they realise it or not, to take sides in this angelic conflict. The nation of Israel is so intimately connected with the angels of God, that the stars of God, that this attack unprovoked against Israel is portrayed here as stars falling to the earth. Now, I don't claim to know everything there is to know about this verse, but it seems to me that what Antiochus is doing is he declared war against Israel, and in the process he declared war against the angels, at least the two-thirds that didn't fall originally with Lucifer. Whatever your view on Israel will tell you where you stand in the angelic conflict. Satan's desire is to obliterate Israel, because through Israel the kingdom will come. God's desire to protect Israel, to promote Israel, to see Israel get saved. That's God's desire. And where are you on this? Where do you stand? What's your theological belief system? Anti-Israel or pro-Israel? Whatever you answered there, you've just took a side in the angelic conflict. It doesn't seem to me there's any neutral ground here. And why am I talking like this? Why am I mentioning a lot about Israel? Well, that's because God talks a lot about Israel. I talk a lot about Israel because I want Christians to understand that this tiny state, as much as it looked at this hindrance to world progress, as it looks as a hindrance to world progress, is very important to God. And Antiochus and every other world dictator that follows this pattern, they just went the wrong way. You just stuck your finger in the eyes of God himself. Zechariah 12 and other passages talk about this. So what did Antiochus do then? Well, Daniel's prophecies continue in verse 11. It says, that's the little horn, Antiochus, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. What did Antiochus do? Well, number one, he magnified himself. What else did this man do? He desecrated the temple. He took a pig, and we all know that Jews don't eat pork. He took a pig and sacrificed it on the altar of this temple to humiliate the Jewish people. He even took a statue of Zeus and set it up in the temple that the exiles and the returnees from the exile had built. And did you know that's exactly what the Antichrist is going to do? He's going to do exactly the same thing. He's going to set up an actual image or statue in the rebuilt Jewish temple, which is not yet being built. You say, well, where does the Bible teach all this? Well, you can read it for yourself. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 15, it says this, and he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. What has happened will be again, as Solomon tells us. What does Solomon say in Ecclesiastes 1 verse 9? Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived, other than Christ, of course. And he said this, the thing that hath been, it is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. The whole history yet future that is coming, following the rapture of the church, has already been performed in a rehearsal that we're reading about here in chapter 8, as Daniel is receiving prophecies about Greece and about Antiochus Epiphanes. And notice, if you will, verse 12, as these prophecies continue, it says, and an oath was given against him, and the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Antiochus did all that in the year 170 to 164 BC. And what did he do? Number one, well, he persecuted the Jews. Number two, he stopped the sacrifices that Ezra had started. Number three, he desecrated the temple. Number four, he disregarded the truth. Number five, he performed his own will and will seem as if God, as according to Daniel, that the prophecies that Antiochus will prosper. And that's a troubling statement to see. But at the end of verse 12, it says, and he performs and it will prosper. And so you mean that evil will prosper? Well, for a season they do. And that's something that can disturb us at times. We see the evil prospering all the time. Look at what I now term the globalist elites. They seem to prosper. Most of the richest men in the world are all into the globalist elites, seeking to control you and control me. And they seem to prosper. And it can sometimes be disheartening that they seem to prosper, and we think, Lord, what's going on here? Well, very early on in my Christian Bible reading days, one of my people have favourite psalms, and my favourite psalm for years was Psalm 73. And you might want to read that sometime. That talks about looking at the wicked and seeing how they prosper. And then eventually the psalmist says, until all it seems wrong that they're prospering, until I entered into the sanctuary of the Lord, and God gave him a vision of the end. And that's what I keep trying to emphasize, that though things are bad, though things are hard, though things are difficult, we are on the winning side. This life is just a vapor, and we've got all eternity to experience everything that God has for us. Now, what does God have for us? Well, it says, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, neither has it entered into the thoughts of the hearts of men what God has prepared for those that love him. So whatever it is, it's good. And we're just here for a short time. So we need to persevere. So we get to verse 13 then. Then I heard one saint speaking to another saint, and he said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall the vision be concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? Well, this scene is so bothersome that one angel in Daniel's vision asks another angel, this desecration of the temple that Antiochus is doing, how long is it going to last? Well, how long, O Lord? And you get the answer in verse 14. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. This means that 2,300 days, the date when the temple was cleansed, is well established as December the 25th in 165 BC. If we count back 2,300 days from then, we come to the year when Antiochus Epiphanes began his persecution in earnest in 171 BC. And so it says there, the sanctuary shall be cleansed. This amazingly specific prophecy was written some 350 years before the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Great prophetic fulfillments like this demonstrate that God not only knows the future, he also guides the future. And so we pick it up now in verse 15. And it came to pass, when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision, and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Uli, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell down on my face. But he said unto me, understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground. But he touched me and set me upright. And he said, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. Now, I don't want you to get too confused about this expression, time of the end. This is not the end, as in the end time as we think of it. This is the end of the empire of Greece, because that's the context that we're dealing with here. The ram, which verse 20 says, the ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media Persia. And verse 21, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Verse 21 and verse 22 tell us as clearly as language can tell that the ram is a reference to the Medes, to the kings of Media and Persia. And likewise, the rough goat is the king of Greece. It adds a little detail at the end of the first king, as clearly Alexander the Great. It says, now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. So notice then, first of all, verse 23. It says, this prophecy concerns the latter time of their kingdom. Whose kingdom? The kingdoms that we've just been discussing, the 2 kingdoms of Media, Persia and Greece. A lot of people look at that word latter time and they think, well, that's talking about the end. And in context, it's not talking about the end. It's talking about the end of Greece. Because in verse 20 and 21, which we just read, we saw very clearly that these prophecies that Daniel is seeing concern the ram, which is Persia, and the goat, which is Greece. The end here is not the end of everything. It's the end of the reign of Greece. I mean, we talk, don't we, sometimes of the end of the church age. We don't say, oh, well, that's the end of the world. We know that there's things that happen after that. So when you go back to verse 17, it talks about the time of the end. At the end of verse 17, it says, so he came near where I stood. And when I came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. So again, it's the vision. It's the context of the vision. The vision of the 2 empires, Media, Persia and Greece. And then again, at the end of verse 19, it says the time of the end. It says, and he said, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. For at the time appointed, the end shall be. So not every end is the end of everything. And what do I keep emphasizing again and again in our church here? Context, context, context. Needs to be everything you read and everything you understand and study, it needs to be studied in context. So we get down and we're closing now in verse 24, and it says, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper, and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. And he shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. And in those 2 verses, when you take them together, it does sound very much like the Antichrist, how we describe him. And just for context, again, context, I want to read to you 3 verses. If you've got your Bible, and turn to Revelation 13. I'm just going to read the first 10 verses. And I want you to have those verses in mind, what we've just read. It talks about prospering, about destroying the mighty and the holy people. It talks about him magnifying himself. And so as we read verse from Revelation 13, verses 1 to 10, we have these words. And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his head the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard. His feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the feet of a lion. And a dragon gave him power, and his seat, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds, and tongues, and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. So just those few verses there describe exactly what the Antichrist, the actual Antichrist, will do. And it's mirrored here in what Antiochus Epiphanes did back in the 1st century, in the 170 BC to 164 BC. So it's a mirror, it's like a pattern, if you will, of, as we say, things will continue. And that's and this is again what Antiochus did, and it's what the Antichrist will also do. It's a pattern, it's a prefigurement. And then we finish with these two verses, verse 26. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Interesting thing there about Daniel, and we'll come again to this near the end of the book of Daniel. Daniel is told to seal up the vision, but none will understand it. Yeah, I've just spent nearly an hour explaining, not explaining it, but the prophecies there. We now understand it again through the hindsight of archaeology and through history. We can look back and see how things progressed and how things were fulfilled. And so it should be an encouragement to us that God has everything in control. It's all in his hand. And so, again, we need to keep things in perspective. Yes, something happened in the past. Something will happen in the future. But it's all laid out before us. As I said, as I read from Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. God, in his goodness and in his grace, has revealed to us what will be, what will happen, so that we can be prepared. So I hope that I've made a little bit of sense this evening. I'll be honest with you, I've struggled all week with this message. I particularly struggled with verse 10. I'll be honest and say that I struggled to understand that, and I couldn't get any competent scholar to kind of open it up. And so, what I shared, I thought, well, that seems the most plausible explanation. And sometimes there are scriptures that take a lot of digging. Sometimes you'll come across something and you just jot it down in your notebook. And sometimes, you'll be just going about your business and God will reveal something to you. You say, oh, that's what that means. And that's why we're always encouraged to read the Bible for ourselves. All I'm doing is doing my best to try and make sense of things. I think that the best thing, or the thing that I would desire more than anything to know, is that you thought, you don't agree with me, so I'm going to go back and check him out against the scriptures. That is my prayer, and my heart's desire is that you will not just, and I say this often, you will not just accept what I say. I can be wrong, and sometimes I've been wrong. I've changed my views in recent months through doing a little bit extra study. But what my desire is for you to say, well, I'm going to check out what Martin's saying there at the front. As I said, this chapter in particular, I could have just come to the front and read the chapter, because a lot of it is self-explanatory. But what use would that be? I'm just trying to give you some food for thought, trying to encourage you to take some notes down and think, I'm going to check that out. Because there are things that we miss, or there are things that we are not quite sure about. That's the value of meeting together. That's the value of fellowshipping together. Because you may have some insights that I don't have. I may, unlikely, have some insights that you don't have. But we're all there to help and edify one another. And that's the purpose and the value of these meetings. So, dare I ask if there's any questions? If there is, just ask me, quickly, and then we'll break for tea. Any questions?